Good morning again, and thank you all for joining. I'm Jess Turquette, a Communications Advisor at RRCEA. This is one of two consultation webinars on the authority's proposed registry fees for blue box materials and hazardous and special products. You may have joined us earlier in the spring when we did our first phase of consultation on 2020 registry fees for tires, batteries, and electronics. So this is the second phase of 2021 registry fees. We will be hosting a second webinar tomorrow afternoon at 2, but we will be presenting the same information as we are today. During the webinars, we will be outlining the proposed 2021 registry fees for blue box materials and HSP, the authority's revised 2021 budget, and the allocation of program costs. As well as we'll be using this time to answer any of your questions and seek your feedback on the fees. Ooh, next slide, please. We'll be pausing throughout the webinar to answer your questions. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in your question or comment and click send. You also can type in any, if you're having any kind of technical audio issues, you can type them in there as well. There's also the upvote feature where you can like another person's question. And so this can be used if you're thinking the same thing, you want that person's question answered. So by liking the question, it will move the question up the queue and prompt us to answer it faster. So that's another feature that you can use. If we can't get to your question for any reason, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. As always, this webinar is being recorded and we'll be posting both recordings as well as the slides to our website later this week, and you'll receive an email when they have been posted. Next slide. Here's the agenda for today's session. We will be starting out with just a little bit of background about the authority, especially for those of you who might be new to us. Then diving into the fee setting methodology and the cost allocation across all the programs. Then we'll be speaking to the proposed fees for blue box and HSP. Towards the end, we'll just do a quick poll where I'll be seeking your feedback on the consultation and how we can improve our sessions going forward. And then following up the webinar with just next steps on how you can submit your feedback. Next slide, please. I will now hand it over to Noah Gitterman, our Registrar and General Counsel. He'll be leading today's session. Noah, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Jeff. I'm Noah, I'm the Registrar. I'm going to be walking through a presentation, hopefully a short presentation about our proposal on fees for HSP and blue box. And talking about the overall budget allocation to the different registry programs we have active this year. So a lot of what I will walk through now is was in the consultation material that we posted on our website already. So I'll try not to spend too much time on things folks already know. There's a few additional items to cover in this presentation that aren't in what was posted on the website. So I'll spend time there. I guess that's it. So for an introduction, why don't we get started? So first slide, please. So when we do these fee consultations, we often start out just with a description of who and what the authority is, so maybe I'll spend a bit of time on that because we do have two new programs now, HSP and blue box, who will be paying fees. And so we are RRCEA, Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority. You'll hear me calling us RRCEA probably throughout this presentation. RRCEA is the regulator mandated by the government to administer the regulations under the RRCEA and the WDTA. So the legislative framework is in those two statutes, and then the specific rules for each program are in the regulations that the ministry develops and cabinet approves. And so under the RRCEA, we have a new regulatory framework that requires producers to be individually accountable and financially responsible for their products and packaging at their end of life. And so again, we've got two new programs this year, HSP and Blue Box. We've overseen the windup and transition of 3 waste diversion programs already, the tires program and the batteries and electronics program. The fees for those programs have already been set. And that was to accommodate our need to start getting their 2021 reporting campaigns either underway or at least in process. And so it's been a 2-phase fees consultation for 2021. And I'll talk a bit more about that, I think, in some of the later slides. Next slide, please, Isabella. Thanks. So hopefully all of you know this already. If you're here, in June, the government released 2 new regulations, which will see the 2 remaining legacy waste diversion programs under the WDTA transition over to the new framework under the RRCEA, and that's of course the Blue Box regulation and the Hazardous and Special Products regulation, which I will refer to as HSP from now on. These regulations require obligated parties to register and report to the authority through our registry. And the registry is an online platform that allows the authority to securely and confidentially collect information from obligated parties and to do the compliance and enforcement work that we need to do, as well as help us report out publicly on performance pursuant to our mandate. I will note that for the Blue Box and HSP registrants in 2021, we won't have had time to set up a registry, an online registry portal for you in 2021. So the registration reporting that needs to happen will be using an alternative process based on Excel sheet templates that will be posted on our website. And so, for example, if you're paying fees, you'll be filling those out, your fee invoice will be generated through that Excel sheet based process. If you want more details about it, we probably shouldn't get into it in this seminar, but our registry and compliance team is ready to help answer your questions about that. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our finances. We are an administrative authority designated under the statute or statutes to administer regulations, to implement regulatory programs. Although we're set up by statute, we do not receive any government funding. So all of our operations are funded through the fees that we charge to regulated entities on a cost recovery basis. The WDTA and RRCEA allow us to give us the statutory authority to set and collect fees to recover our costs of running the programs under those statutes. And so our fee revenues come from two sources, from the RRCEA, which are right now annual fees to obligated parties who are required to register and report to us under the waste diversion regulations under the RRCEA. And we collect fees under the WDTA, which are monthly cost recovery charges to IFOs and ISOs to recover the costs of our oversight and compliance activities under the WDTA. So the RRCEA fees, which we typically call registry fees, cover our costs, not just to develop and operate the registry, but to run all of the costs that are required to administer the programs under the RRCEA. So all of the compliance and enforcement activities we do, all of the registry support activities we do, and everything that's needed to support those activities has to be recovered through the registry fees that we set. That's the only way for us to recover our costs. The WDTA monthly charges cover the authority's cost to oversee, as I mentioned, oversee the operation of IFOs and ISOs. Under the RRCEA, so for the registry fees, there are some rules about how we set fees. And in particular, we're obligated to consult on fees for 45 days. And then once fees are set, they need to be posted for at least 30 days. So we are right now in the 45-day period, consultation period for HSP and Blue Box registry fees. So that's the focus of this presentation, and that's the purpose of this consultation period. I'm hoping later on, if it hasn't been mentioned already, the deadline for the consultation period will be, you'll be reminded of it. It's on our website if you don't know what it is, but I'm sure at some point we will get to it. So we do, if you do have, want to provide written input on our fee proposal, we encourage you to do so as soon as you can. And we are actually targeting to set fees, I think in mid-August, which will allow us to begin our registration campaigns for Blue Box producers and HSP producers. Next slide, please. So the scope of this consultation, I alluded to this a bit earlier. This is really phase 2 of our 2021 registry fee setting process. What we'll be talking about today are again, the fees, the proposed fees for the Blue Box and HSP programs. We already set fees for the tires and the batteries and E programs. And again, that was necessitated because of the different, because the Blue Box and HSP fee regulations have not yet been released. The tires and the batteries and E fees were, because we didn't have all of our regulations in hand, the tires and batteries and E fees were based on 2020 fees. Those have already been set. I think for the tires folks, they've already gone through a cycle of reporting and registry fee payment. The batteries and E folks, it's coming up in a few weeks. So in this consultation period, we're focusing again on the fees for the new regulations, Blue Box and HSP, but we will also be presenting, or we are also presenting our revised 2021 budget for the registry programs and the allocation of that budget to each of the programs. So if you were on our website, you will have seen some of that already, and I'll review it again in a slide or two. Next slide, please. So a little bit about, again, because we have two new programs here, I want to talk a little bit about our fee setting principles. So let's get right into it on the next slide. We have a fee setting policy which is posted on our website. It was developed back in 2017, which sets out objectives, principles, and rules to guide our fee setting process. We will be consulting on updates to the fee setting policy and another document called our fee setting methodology later this year when we consult on 2022 fees. And we'll be focusing then on updating those policies to reflect how our registry fees are currently structured. Next slide, please. Some high-level objectives set out in our policy when we set fees. We want the process to be transparent. We want the charges to be reasonable and to reflect our costs. Again, we have to recover all of our costs through our fees. Long-term financial sustainability of RRCEA is an important objective. Fee predictability is an important objective for RRCEA. It's something we're working on as we're sort of growing and starting up new programs, and is an important objective for us, and ensuring the fees we set are fair. Next slide, please. There's a few principles that we use when setting up our fee setting methodology and to help guide the process. And these are developed, from a best practices guideline released by the OECD. And there's 9 factors that are best practices for implementing a regulatory program that is based on recovering fees from participants. And you can see the 9 on the list here. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I'm happy to answer questions about it if folks have it. Next slide, please. So there's 3 current rules that we apply when we're setting fees for a registry program. So number 1 is no proration. So fees are charged for the calendar year in which the fees are paid. So what that means for HSP and Blue Box folks is that your fee doesn't change simply because your registration starts, sometime in the middle of the year as opposed to sometime at the beginning of the year. The fee is an annual fee and not prorated. We don't do in-year adjustments, so adjustments to fees will be reflected in the calculation of fees for the next calendar year. So there's a true up at the end of the year, and that gets reflected in the next year's fees. And we apply fees to each program. So if you're a producer of tires and electronics, you will pay 2 fees, one for the tires program, one for the batteries and electronics program. Next slide, please. So our high-level methodology starts first with our budget. Our budget then needs to be allocated to the registry side, the RRCEA, and the WDTA side. Within the registry budget, we then allocate expenses by program, considering both direct costs and each program's share of our common costs. And then for each program, then we allocate expenses by type of regulated party and determine the type of fee that will be paid by those who are paying. So for example, whether it's fixed or variable fee. Next slide, please. The 2021 RRCEA budget has been revised from the budget that was presented in our business plan. So RRCEA publishes a business plan every year that is finalized at the end of the summer and then published, I think, on the 1st or 2nd day of October every year. So we have a published business plan for 2021. That budget has been revised and the registry revenue needs have been increased by 2.3 million compared to what was published in the 2021 business plan. Those increases to our budget resulted from changes to the assumptions that were underlying the original business plan document. And some of those assumptions include the fact that the blue box regulation is coming into force in 2021, which is earlier than we had anticipated when we set our 2021 budget, and that we've been directed to develop and operate an excess soil registry, again, which was not assumed in the 2021 budget. So those are two of the bigger changes that required us to invest in resources and increase our revenue needs in 2021. I should also note that in addition to these new delivery mandates for 2021, the result of those changes meant that we would be starting up, multiple new registry projects in 2021, building portals for batteries and E, for excess soil and hazardous waste digital reporting services, and overlapping registration and compliance campaigns. So we've got HSP and Blue Box and a tires and a batteries and E campaign running this year. So we needed to make sure we had enough resources in place to manage all of that activity at once. So what we've done essentially is that we've adjusted our resourcing plans in part by moving forward or moving up resource growth that had been planned for later years. And that's been accelerated to accommodate the new programs we've got in 2020. So I think I mentioned the increase. So our RRCEA or registry, our revenues for 2021 are increasing from the 7.38 million we had predicted in the business plan to 9.67 million to accommodate those increased delivery expectations. So next slide, please. So here's a picture of our revised budget with the split between WDTA and RRCEA. And you'll see the $9.67 million figure on the RCEA or registry side. So that $9.67 million figure is made up of direct costs. I'll get into what those are, I think, on the next slide, and common or shared costs. So direct costs are charged out directly to the programs. Common costs are charged out through a program weighting methodology that I think we'll take a look at in a minute. Next slide, please. So the forecasted direct expenses, so that was the smaller piece of pie in the green circle on the previous slide. That includes amortized registry costs for a program portal. So right now we've got a tires registry portal. So tires registrants can go in to our online registry and access the system in the way they need to. We will have a batteries and E portal up and running hopefully in a few weeks. And so the batteries and electronics folks will be using that portal for the first time this year. And so those specific portal costs get charged out to directly to the program they relate to. There are also registry foundational costs, or really common elements that all of the different program portals rely on in our registry. Those registry foundational costs, well, I should say they're, things like account management functions, security, a lot of the sort of back end compliance management functions we have are consistent across all those programs. And so those foundational costs are shared by all the programs that use the registry. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that sharing works, but that's another direct cost. So those are the primary costs that make up that smaller pie that was in the green circle on the previous slide. The remaining costs are our shared costs, which include personnel and salaries, the compliance and enforcement function that helps to run the regulated programs, and all of the support that needs from communications and finance and IT. And those are divided up on a program weight approach, which I will get to in a couple of slides. So just wanted to explain a bit about how foundational costs are allocated. So I think this may be a new slide that wasn't in the one on our website. So the registry foundational costs today, remember, those are the common elements that each registry program relies on. We've invested $4.7 million in those common elements to date. All registry costs, whether it's your specific program portal or your common elements, are amortized over a 10-year period. And you begin paying your portion of those amortized costs when your program is up and running, like when registrants have to start registering. So Tires has been paying its portion of those costs since the Tires program was up and running in 2018. HSP and Blue Box will start paying its portion of those costs this year. Batteries and E started paying its portion in 2020. The foundational costs are allocated among the programs, but will be paid out in such a way that each program will have paid the same amount of costs over time. So just because you started paying earlier doesn't mean you get charged more of the common elements. You still pay your fair share of those common elements, just at a different pace. A small portion of common element registry costs were also allocated to the WDTA in 2018 and 2019 only, but the WDTA budget no longer includes any registry foundational costs. Again, for 2021, all of the programs paying fees, Tires, Batteries, and E, Blue Box, and HSP will be starting to pay their amortized portion of those common element costs. Tires and Batteries and E will also have some costs related to their individual portal. Blue Box and HSP won't have that individual portal cost yet because those portals have not been built. Next slide, please. So in order to divide up our common costs, we use a program weight approach. And the first program, which is our Tires program, serves as the benchmark, and so gets a program weight of 1. And then other programs are scaled up or down relative to Tires to reflect the overall effort and oversight activity and implementation activity that has to go into those programs, taking into account some key factors, including the number of producers, the number and complexity of the regulations, and the effort required to oversee the material categories and collection networks. So starting with tires with a program weighting of 1, Blue Box has a weighting of 3. And so Blue Box has, we're predicting more than triple the number of producers in the tires program. The batteries and E program with a program weighting of 2 involves 2 regulations that are linked but separate. So it is treated as 1 program with a program weight of 2 relative to tires, and HSP gets a program weight of 1.5 to reflect the fact that although there are a number of different material categories in that regulation, and the programs for each look different and require some additional effort. So for example, 2 of the categories under the HSP regulation have a program that looks similar to the tires program, but there are additional categories of materials for example, for fertilizers, for thermometers, thermostats, and barometers that require that are different programs and require some additional effort on top of the programs for the other categories. And so to accommodate those, the HSP program gets a 1.5 share. Next slide, please. I think we're the next one after this. Here we go. So here is, so the results of the direct costs plus the share of the common costs leads to this allocation of the overall registry budget of 9.67 million. And those are the amounts we need to recover from each program in 2021. Now, as I mentioned, the tires and B programs, sorry, batteries and E, you may hear me refer to the batteries and E program as the B program. So I apologize for that in advance, but it's kind of, once I have an abbreviation lodged in my mind, it's hard to get rid of it. So the tires and batteries and E programs, those fees are already set. To the extent there is a difference between the revenues from those fees and the budget allocation that's presented here, that'll get trued up at the and accounted for in either the 2022 fee setting process or the 2023 fee setting process. That's actually true for all of the programs to the extent that fees are set based on both budget, right? So we're setting fees now based on a mid-year budget that we're predicting. And fees are also set based on an assumption about how many producers are going to register and how much weight they're going to report. And at the end of each year, there is always a true up for each of the programs to the extent to match up the actual budget expenditures in that year, which need to be recovered, and how much revenue came in that year. So that always gets trued up either in the next registry year or 2 years following. Either there's a deficit that gets carried over or there's a surplus that gets carried over. And that just gets added to or subtracted from the budget in the following years. Next slide, please. Oh, so I think I think the idea was to pause here for questions about what has been presented so far. So what I haven't presented yet are the actual registry fees for Blue Box and HSP. Those are on the slides that come next. But I guess I'm happy to take questions about what I've presented so far.
Great, thanks, Noah. Yeah, and on that, I'll try to organize them so any questions that are related more so to the fees themselves or will come after that next section. Also, just to keep in mind that any sort of very general questions I might save until the end, just so we can get through the fee specific ones definitely throughout the webinar. And then if there's time at the end, any kind of more general one we'll try to get to as well. So the first question for you, Noah, is are the fees annual?
So the short answer to that is yes. So the model is that the fees are paid annually by the folks that are coming in to register and report to us on an annual basis. Now we do set fees. Right now we're setting fees every year. And so we're just setting fees for 2021. There will be another fee setting process for 2022 fees, which we think will happen later this year. So we actually have the fees in place before the year before 2022 starts. So there is a process right now. Because we're growing and getting new programs each year, there is a process every year now to set fees. That may change in the future, but the model right now is annual fees, annual registry fees for producers to cover the annual cost of running these programs.
Great. This is a question from the same individual. Will the fees, will it be a flow through cost for producers and brand owners?
So I'm not sure what's meant by flow through, but the fee is an obligation of the producer to pay or have paid. The RRCEA fee is only a small portion of the overall financial obligation that a producer might have under the program. So the fee you're paying to RRCEA covers RRCEA's costs only. That is the cost for running the registry and implementing the regulation and the compliance and enforcement communications that are needed to support implementation of those programs. That is unrelated to the costs that producers will have to make sure that their end-of-life materials get collected and managed. So RRCEA doesn't set that cost. That cost is set in the marketplace. RRCEA's fee is so from that perspective, RRCEA's fee is a small portion of the overall financial responsibility on producers under these regulations.
Next question here is RPRA replacing Stewardship Ontario's role once the Blue Box program wraps up in 2023 to 25, or is RPRA only supporting the transition period into the IPR model?
So once the Blue Box program wraps up, and the Blue Box program is actually wrapping up over a period of a few years, so won't be finally wrapped up until the end of 2025, I think, because municipalities are transferring over to the new regulation in phases or tranches. So the Stewardship Ontario, the WDTA Blue Box program, is still running through 2025, but after it is wrapped up, then Stewardship Ontario also wraps itself up and liquidates. So Stewardship Ontario is a statutory organization under the WDTA. Once it doesn't have a program to run anymore, then it's obligated to wind itself up. And so there won't be a Stewardship Ontario anymore once all of those wind up activities are done. That is a few years in the future. But if you're interested, the plan for the Stewardship Ontario wind up is posted on our website. So at that point, once the old program is done, the waste diversion program then is being run only under the RRCEA.
Question here regarding Blue Box. As Ontario municipalities will commence transition to the full EPR over a 3-year period, meaning 1/3 each year based on population, how will RPRA determine steward fees over that 3-year program? As a portion of Ontario municipalities will continue to pay 50% of Blue Box costs until they transition. Full EPR will not be in effect until January 1st, 2026, where will all stewards simply start to pay their fees based on 100% EPR effective July 1st, 2020.
So that's a question about fees under the WDTA Blue Box program. I can say at a very high level that the fees under the WDTA program cover roughly 50% of the costs that municipalities are inputting into the data call system. As municipalities transfer out of the data call system and transition to the RRCEA, they won't be inputting those costs anymore. And so those transition municipalities won't be funded anymore, but it is a transition process, and exactly how that will impact the steward fees is probably a good question for Stewardship Ontario. If you're a steward, or if not, you can follow up maybe with us separately, and we can put you in touch with the folks who run our WDTA Blue Box program.
There are a number of questions regarding how the fees are set in terms of weight-based versus unit-based. So I'm going to hold off on those questions until we go into the next couple slides where we actually speak to that a little bit more, and then we can answer those questions then. So if those people could just hold tight, but there are quite a few of those. There's one question here though that I think we could answer now. When a producer has a pro acting on their behalf who is responsible for the oversight, and producers are already paying the pro an administrative fee and all the program expenses, what added value does RPRA bring in oversight or additional effort?
So the role that RIPRA has under the program is to make sure that everyone, including producers, pros, and other service providers, are fulfilling their obligations under the program. And so that includes, for example, making sure that all the producers who have obligations under the program are registered and both paying RIPRA's fees, but also contributing to their obligations to collect and manage resources. And we also, so that's a key part of our compliance and enforcement role, but we're also making sure that the different pros and the different service providers are meeting their obligations with respect to collection and management and the standards that they need to meet in performing those roles. I should probably mention that this, in addition to compliance enforcement, there is also a public responsibility to report out on performance on behalf of the province on some regular basis.
Okay, as I mentioned, I think a lot of these questions will make more sense after the next section. So now we can start with those slides, and then we'll get to these questions following that.
Okay. So well, let's dive into the Blue Box and HSP fees. So as with the tires and the B fees, the proposed 2021 registry fees for Blue Box and HSP only include fees for producers. We're not proposing fees for service providers or pros. The Blue Box and HSP programs use a variable and flat fee structure. So again, matching how we've set fees for tires and for B. Smaller producers have a flat fee, and then larger producers have a variable fee. Due to the structure of the HSP regulations, I talked about this a little bit earlier, the proposed fees for HSP look a bit different. So the category A and B materials, their fees are set up in a way that's similar to how tires and B fees are set up. Categories C, D, and E look different because those programs are different. And so I think our proposal combines the C and E programs, which are similar with a flat registry fee and then another fee for category D. Next slide, please. So these are the fees we we are proposing for the Blue Box program. This was the same material that was in the that was posted on our website when we kicked off our consultation. So there's a $75 flat fee that's consistent with tires and B for producers producing less than 100,000 kilograms of obligated material. Then a variable fee for those producing more than that at 0.38 cents per kilogram. We've made some assumptions both about the total number of producers and how many in each category and how much weight in the variable fee category, which are on the screen. And we're definitely always happy to have feedback on whether you think these assumptions look correct. So this slide is explaining, and again, I think this was on the website for that we posted a few weeks ago, explaining how we've sort of allocated within the HSP program. So again, categories A and B, that program very similar to how the tires program works, and we're allocating them a portion of the total program budget, and that will get recovered through a fixed and variable fee that looks a lot like the other programs. Categories C and E, which are the mercury containing devices and refillable propane containers. Those categories have some collection and management responsibilities, but in a reduced form with substantially reduced obligations compared to the other programs. So they're allocated a smaller portion of the budget. And then category in D, which doesn't include collection and management responsibility, but does include responsibilities just around promotion and education, gets its own smaller allocation. Those two categories, so C and E together and D, are charged out a flat fee to recover those costs. Next slide, please. So category A and B, again, $75 flat fee for the smaller producers. For the larger producers, we're looking at 1.3 cent per kilogram fee. For category C and E producers, so the refillable propane containers and the mercury containing devices, we're proposing a $7,500 flat fee. And then for the fertilizer producers, a $4,000 flat fee. So again, like with Blue Box, we're showing you our assumptions for the number of producers and the number of weight and the amount of weight in the variable category. We very much appreciate feedback on whether we're getting those numbers correct. And so now I think we're up for questions.
Yes, and we do have quite a few here. So we'll try to get as many as possible. So first question here is related to the weight-based versus unit-based approach for setting the fees. As it seems now, based on the weight-based approach, paint producers will be paying more to RPRA than they pay the pro for administration for the entire program in Ontario. How is that allocation fair, rational, or per OECD principle sustainability when consumers will have to pay more in what is effectively a tax than for program operations focused on waste recovery?
Thanks for that question. I don't actually know offhand what the costs were to operate the entire program under the WDTA, and I certainly don't know what they will be under the new regulation yet. Typically, the fees that we set, that RRCEA sets, are a portion of what the total financial obligation is for producers. And those fees need to recover RRCEA's costs for running the program, which is not just an administrative function, but also a compliance and enforcement function to ensure that all obligated parties are meeting their obligations in the way that they should be, and public-facing function to report out on performance for these programs on behalf of Ontario. Next question.
Next question. This is a two-parter. Do I understand correctly that Blue Box stewards will pay $3.51 million just in 2021? Second part, if that is the case, what do the Blue Box stewards get for that $3.5 million, as I don't think the registry is developed yet? Similar question for HSP stewards, as we thought that we'd be registering on an Excel sheet as the registry is not built yet.
Right. So that's correct. That's the amount budgeted to the Blue Box program for this year. So what those costs cover are our entire costs of running the Blue Box program this year. So for Blue Box, that includes all of the work we need to do to make sure that obligated producers get registered, that they're reporting correctly, that municipalities are reporting all of the information they need to report, and all of the compliance, enforcement, and communication activity that supports those functions. Similarly with HSP, So helping producers understand what their obligations are, making sure that the producers who need to register get registered, and are paying their fee to RRCEA, but are also fulfilling their obligation to collect and manage resources. Those are all activities that we need to undertake this year, even in the absence of an online registry. So as mentioned, we will have an alternative way to report to RRCEA because those registries aren't built yet. They will be built eventually, and that's similar to how we ran the batteries and e-registration and reporting campaigns for 2020. And again, because of the timing of the regulation, we also didn't have a batteries and e-program, batteries and e-registry portal built for their first round of registrations. We do have it built, or will be ready hopefully at the beginning of August for batteries and e-reporting. Eventually you will see that for Blue Box and HSP. But in the absence of the registry portal, there is still a lot of work that we need to do to make sure that everyone knows what their obligations are and are fulfilling them.
This is regarding our role as a regulator and what our responsibilities are. You said the role is to ensure service providers fulfill obligations. How is that done when contracts are with pros?
So the obligations that service providers have under the regulation are obligations that RRCEA enforces. There may be commercial arrangements in the background, and there will be commercial arrangements in the background, obviously, for producers to help meet their obligations, and also for service providers to provide the services on behalf of those producers. But service providers have reporting obligations to RRCEA, and processors need to meet certain standards, among other things, and those are obligations that RRCEA helps develop and enforce.
This is a follow-up from a previous question when they asked about what flow-through. So looking for flow-through means to be passed on to the consumers as in a separate line item at the point of sale.
So that it is up to producers for the, I'm pretty sure for all of the regulations other than the tires regulation, it is up to producers to figure out how they want to charge out their RRCEA costs and their other costs of running their programs. If they want to use visible fees, that's not regulated under the batteries and electronics regulations, the HSP regulation, or the Blue Box regulation. There are still consumer protection rules that apply to those fees, and in particular that they can't be misrepresented. And there's actually a web page on our on the RRCEA site that has some additional information around visible fees. So I encourage you to go look at it. And if you have more questions, you can call into or email the registry team at registry@rrcea.ca. The tires folks do have special rules about visible fees that are built into their regulation, and there is material also on our website that talks about how those obligations can be fulfilled.
Next question, what is the ratio of current Blue Box costs in terms of registry development costs and transition costs being charged to producers until the start of the program in 2023?
So if the question is focused on registry costs, until the Blue Box registry portal is up and running, the Blue Box will be supporting their portion of the total foundation or common element components of the registry. And then their specific portal costs once that portal gets built. Even before the transition to producer responsibility in 2023, there are reporting and registration requirements that we need to enforce and we need to manage. And so that is what the Blue Box fees are covering, as well as some oversight and enforcement related to the rules creation process that's built into that regulation.
So if the fees are weight-based, why would a consumable product like paint have the fee based on the weight sold versus the weight that is actually managed? Only 10% maximum of paint sold is recovered compared to oil filters, which are actually heavier end of life than when sold. Then there are products like oil containers sold full of oil, which is not a designated product in Ontario, and only the container weight is counted.
So I think part of the answer to that question is that we want to set up, as much as we can, a simple and predictable way to assess fees on our producers. And we get producer, and most of the programs, we get producer supply reporting on an annual basis by weight. And that provides an efficient way for us to assess fees. If you have an alternative suggestion for how that might work based on managed amounts, I think we'd be happy to see that proposal. Like with all of the suggestions, because I think I see a few in this long list of questions, we encourage all of you to submit responses in writing with your association's views about the proposal we're presenting here.
Next question, when will the HSP registry be available for registration for producers and pros?
So for, it will be two different timelines. I think the pro registration process will likely get kicked off in a few weeks. The producer registration process will follow that. We will be communicating with individual producers and producer associations to make sure that everyone knows what those deadlines are when they need to know them. And so I can't give you a firm date right now because we're still trying to wrap our heads around the regulation we need to implement. But it will be happening over the summer and early fall.
And maybe we clarify now that the registry, the online registry itself won't be available for registration this year, but.
Right, so it'll be a registration campaign. Won't be through an online portal, but you will, producers will be given all of the material they need to register and report to us. We try to make it as easy as possible. It's some extra work for us to run what we call the sort of non-online manual process. we try to make it as easy as possible for the producers to get done what they need to get done and fulfill their obligations.
So this, if I did the math right, 100,001 kilogram would pay $380, but 99,000 kilograms would pay $75. Is that reasonable?
So I'm just, I don't know if there's a way for me to see. Oh, I see the question on the slide.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't tell you right now that that math is correct. You're right that there can sometimes be a discrepancy right at the margin of the flat fee and the variable fee. We try to manage that as best we can. Given our methodology to use a flat fee for those small producers, there will inevitably be some kind of discrepancy at the margin. We try to limit it as much as possible. If you have additional feedback on sort of what the cutoff should be, given the assumptions we presented in the slide, we're happy to hear it.
And there are a few questions here, and we spoke to a number of them already, again, just about the weight-based versus unit-based and when the weight is applied. So why are the fees weight-based, and how does that approach reflect RPRA's functions, expenses? This is unfair as it favors styrofoam versus metal, for example. And then there's a couple other questions regarding, as I think was asked earlier about paint or liquid products, and why, is it weight-based at the time of when it's being sold versus when it's being managed?
Yeah, so part of the reason why we use a weight-based approach is because that is what is getting reported in, that is how producers are reporting into the registry under the regulation that the government has approved. So for HSP, producers are report supply by weight, and our variable fee is based on that supply reporting. Again, if you have different suggestions for how to manage that reporting, we are happy to hear them. Again, our guiding principles to be, predictability and reasonability and fairness, and that's what we strive to achieve, while keeping in mind, the overall purpose of the program and how they're run, how they're set up under the regulations that we've been given to administer.
Producers are trying to calculate their weight supplied, example, paint and others. When will the conversion factors be available in order to calculate the weight supplied?
That's a good question. I think it's, I assume that's about the HSP program because of the reference to paint. So the short answer is I don't know, but it will be in time for producers to do what they need to do to get their reports into RRCEA. So again, we're still trying to work through some of the details of the regulation that was released, and we will be communicating, just like we did with tires and with the batteries and electronics programs. We will be communicating individually with producers and reaching them however we can through associations and other groups to make sure that they have everything they need to get their reports into us. I should mention that with any of the questions today that are about implementation, that aren't directly about fees, but about reporting, registration, and compliance and enforcement, our compliance and registry team is available to start helping folks work through this stuff. And you can reach the team at registry@ripra.ca. Now for the HSP program, you may get a message back from a compliance officer that's along the lines of, hold on, we're working on more information and will get communicated to you. But you can always reach out to the registry team for questions about registration and compliance.
So on that topic, actually, there may be some businesses obligated to register but may not register on time. Is it RPRA's responsibility to enforce compliance?
Yes. It is a key part of RIPRA's job is to make sure that all of the obligated producers register and report, and also fulfill their substantive obligations to collect and manage their material. And so we have a program, and so we will be implementing programs to get that done for the first time for HSP and Blue Box. But we're always running programs to ensure that what we call free riders, so businesses that aren't yet in the system but should be, come into the system and start meeting their obligations. So that I should point out, that's obviously a benefit. That's a a key mandate of RIPRA's, but obviously also a benefit to the producers who are registered and reporting, to help ensure that there's a level playing field for all of the businesses obligated under these new regulatory frameworks.
Another question here. When is the registry fee invoice due to RPRA once a producer has registered?
That is a great question. I think the producers have 30 days to pay their invoices once they're issued, but I wouldn't but I'm not certain about that. What I am certain about is that how much time you have to pay will be very clear once we launch the registration campaign for your regulation. So if this is HSP, once we launch the campaign, it'll be very clear, what you have to do and what you need to pay and when you need to pay it by. I think typically there's a 30-day payment window. And so once you register and report, as you're required to by the deadline, you'll be issued an invoice.
I'll ask one other question here, and then we'll just with 2 final slides just to show the next steps. But so we'll just and then we'll get to some more questions at the end. Have you considered only asking producers who are not participating in a stewardship program run by a pro to pay a registration fee directly to RPRA?
So if that question is asking about producers who either aren't obligated under the WDTA programs or maybe are obligated but haven't complied with their stewardship obligations under the WDTA programs, but are obligated under the new RRCEA regulations, then the answer is yes, we will. Our job is to help make sure those producers are registered and are paying fees directly to RRCEA. Under the new world, all producers that are obligated, whether they were part of a legacy WDTA program or not, need to register and report and pay their fee. It's a separate question how they fulfill their obligation to collect and manage their material under the regulation. So typically they will need to hire a pro to help make sure that gets done. And they will need to, typically they will need to pay that pro for that service, or I suppose directly with service providers if they want to. So that commercial arrangement happens outside of the RRCEA registry, and is subject to whatever market pressures dictate those fees. So I hope that's a helpful answer to that question.
Thanks, Noah. We'll just take a quick break from Q&As just to get to the final slide. So next slide, please. So we'll just do a really quick poll. We do this in all of our consultation webinars just to get a sense of how we're doing from our stakeholders. So you should see a poll on your screen. So I'll just, for 30 seconds or so, and provide your responses. Okay, thank you. I'll just quickly share the results here. Again, we use this feedback to help us think about how to improve our consultations and our webinars going forward. And if you ever have any other feedback, more specific, feel free to send us an email at consultations@rra.ca. All feedback is extremely helpful for us. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Next steps. Next slide. So just quickly reiterating that both this presentation deck and recording of both today and tomorrow's webinars will be posted to our consultation webpage. Today's deck and recording should be up later today. The deadline to submit your feedback is Tuesday, August 3rd. So you can email it to consultations@rra.ca. Additionally, if you have questions about the proposal and more questions coming out of the webinar and would like to discuss them in more detail, you can also email us at that same email address. Also mention that, there's obviously a number of questions that we weren't able to get to. So we will be following up with people directly following the webinar. We also, we include a Q&A log in our consultation report. So following every consultation we do, we include We post the report where we summarize feedback that we've heard, but we also include a question and answer log at usually in the appendix that captures all of the questions and the answers that we provided. So you can review those there as well. The final fees will be posted to the authority's website, and we will notify stakeholders when they've been posted. As Noah mentioned, that's likely to be in sometime in August. And then we will be communicating directly with producers of Blue Box materials and HSP on how and when they can complete their annual reporting requirements, registration, and pay their registry fees. Again, once the fees have been finalized and posted. So that's it. We can go back to some questions. We have a little bit of time left, so let's try to get to a few more. The question at the top of the list here is, are empty HSP containers, assuming the container is a Blue Box material, permitted to be placed in the Blue Box for recycling?
That's a great question for our registry and compliance team. So I encourage you to reach out. I don't know if we had sort of the registry contact info on our contact info page, but I think it's registry@ripper.ca. So I don't actually, sitting here right now, I don't want to pull a wrong answer out of my head accidentally. But that's exactly the type of question that our compliance and registry team is there to help you with.
Yes, and I just sent that individual the email address, and it is registry@rpra.ca. Next question is, what will the registry deliver that the current pros now and in the future will not be able to?
So what RRCEA delivers is the administration of the regulatory program that the government has approved and is reflected in the regulations covering your material group. So again, I think I've already talked about this a little bit. It is the compliance and enforcement program to ensure that producers, pros, and service providers are meeting their obligations in terms of registration and reporting, but also their substantive obligation to collect and to manage, and obligations related to collection and management. It is RRCEA's mandate to ensure that everyone who has obligations is meeting them, so that there is a level playing field for businesses across the province. In addition to that compliance and enforcement responsibility, we support the ministry in their policy development by providing data information from when they need it, from what we collect through the registry. We also have an obligation to report to the public on the performance of the waste diversion programs that we administer. So what RRCEA does is not, RRCEA doesn't do doesn't manage the collection and management operations that are obligated under the regulations, but we are here to ensure that they are running smoothly on behalf of the province and Ontarians. And part of the way we do that, part of the way we have to do that under our statute is through an electronic registry. So we're obligated to maintain a registry for everyone who's obligated to report into us. And that has to be an electronic registry. It has to have a public component to it. and that is a part of our mandate on behalf of the province. And that registry also helps us implement the compliance and enforcement function we need to do. It also helps us implement what we call the registry support function we need to do. So in addition to all of that, it's really important for us to communicate as well as we can with the folks who are obligated to make sure they understand what they need to do and they understand how they can get it done in the most efficient way that they can, given the obligations and the regulation. So we have what we call a risk-based and compliance-focused approach to how we manage these programs. So part of what that means is that it's really important for us to make sure that we're helping businesses understand their obligations and bring them along into compliance without having to resort to heavy-handed compliance and enforcement tools. We operate using a principle called communication for compliance, or C4C. And we put a lot of effort into that support function. So if you're a producer and you're on this call, you will be talking to a compliance and you will likely be talking to a compliance and registry support officer this year to help you complete, if you're in the HSP or Blue Box regulation, because those are new this year, to help you complete your registration or reporting obligations. And so it's really important to us that we, as efficiently as possible, provide support to businesses so they can come into compliance with the obligations that they've been given under the regulation as efficiently as possible. We try to do that in the first place through webinars, through guides and FAQs that are on our website, through compliance bulletins that help explain some of the trickier aspects of the regulation, also on our website. If you're in the tires or B programs, you will be familiar with that kind of material already. If you're in the HSP and Blue Box programs, you will hopefully start to see that material soon. Our hope is that those materials can be enough to help you through the process without having to talk to us directly. But we also have officers ready to help you when necessary.
Thanks, Noah. So it looks like we're just about out of time. It's just about 11:30. Again, there are a number of questions we didn't get to. As mentioned, we will be providing all of the Q&As in our consultation report that will be posted once the final fees have been posted. If you have additional questions, please send them to consultations@rpra.ca. Again, questions about this proposal itself, as well as feedback you can send there. If you have questions specific to your business needs and your regulatory requirements, please send them to registry@rpra.ca. We thank everybody for their time. Noah, any final words?
No, thanks everyone, and I guess I hope this was a helpful session for folks. I guess I reiterate again what Jess said earlier, that the consultation period is open for feedback. We encourage you to get, if you have additional feedback, to get it into us as soon as you can.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.